There are mistakes a man can ride away from. Then there are mistakes that leave bodies baking under an Arizona sun. This story starts in the dust and the silence, where 5 armed killers made the last bad decision of their miserable lives, and where an old gunfighter made the costly mistake of having a conscience most men riding through the San Pedro Valley in 1885 would have kept their eyes forward and their spurs moving. John Cade was not built like most men. And before that sun dragged itself below the western ridgeline, the red earth would be soaked dark with consequence. The heat in the San Pedro Valley wasn't just temperature, it was presence. It pushed down on a man's shoulders like something alive, crawled under the skin, dried out the marrow. The wind moved but offered no relief. It only carried the smell of scorched earth and something older, something long dead and forgotten beneath the alkali flats. John Cade moved through that heat at a measured pace on a sturdy bay horse named Midnight. He wasn't rushing. Men like Cade had learned long ago that rushing was how you made mistakes, and his mistakes tended to be permanent. He was 42 years old, though his face told a different story entirely. His skin had been cured by decades of sun and wind into something close to rawhide. His eyes sat deep beneath the brim of a weathered hat, dark and still as a dry creek bed, eyes that had watched too many dawns break over too many graves. He wore a heavy wool poncho, salt-stained and road-filthy, the pattern nearly swallowed by years of desert grit. Every thread of it carried the history of a man who had survived things that would have stopped a younger soul cold. He wasn't looking for trouble that afternoon. But trouble in that country had a way of finding Cade.
Please, I beg of you.
Regardless,
Enough
Midnight
talk,
pulled
let's
up
go.
short without being asked.
There's nothing more
The
to
horse's
discuss.
ears swiveled forward, tuned to some frequency just below human hearing. Ahead of them, a sagging ranch gate marked the edge of someone's broken dream. Sun-bleached timber held together by rust and desperation. The windmill behind it stood motionless, its blades locked in a permanent silence. But it wasn't the ranch that stopped Cade. It was what was happening in the yard. 5 men, hard-looking, filth-covered, the kind of men whose eyes held nothing resembling warmth. They stood in a loose arrangement that Cade recognized immediately, the unconscious geometry of predators. And at the center of their circle, kneeling in the hot red dirt, was a young woman. Her name, though Cade didn't know it yet, was Eliza Vance. Her dress was torn and thick with trail dust. Her hair hung loose, tangled from days of running. Her face was streaked with the kind of crying that goes beyond tears, the hollow, exhausted grief of someone who has stopped believing anyone is coming. The largest of the 5 men, a thick-necked brute named Rufus, crouched over her. He had a handful of her hair twisted in one meaty fist. His expression was the expression of a man who had never once in his life been made to answer for anything. Cade sat very still on Midnight's back. He watched. He breathed. He didn't reach for his gun. The silence stretched. Rufus finally looked up and noticed him. He let go of Eliza's hair and rose to his full height, wiping his hand on his trousers like he'd touched something beneath him. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "You're lost, stranger." His voice sounded like boots grinding gravel. The other 4 men turned and assessed Cade the way men assess something. They don't consider a real threat. With that particular brand of lazy contempt that gets people killed, they saw a lone rider, dusty, old, tired, looking. They didn't see what was underneath. "Get gone," Rufus repeated, stepping toward the gate. The others fanned out behind him in that lazy, dangerous way. "Move along while you still can, old man. This ain't your business." Cade's heart beat slow and even in his chest. "The girl," he said. His voice came out low and dry and absolute, like the sound of distant thunder rolling in over the flats. "Let her go. Right now." The yard went quiet. Then the 5 men burst out laughing. It was the hollow laughter of men who had never once bet wrong. The tall one, a whip-thin figure named Slim who moved like he had no bones, doubled over with it. "You hear that, boys? Old man's feeling brave today." "Brave or stupid," another called out, clicking back the hammer of his revolver. The metallic snap cut through the laughter like a blade. Eliza looked up from the dirt. Her eyes found Cade's, and something in what she saw there made her go very still. Not hope exactly. She'd burned through hope 2 days ago. Something else. Something she didn't have a word for yet. She was Silas Vance's daughter. Silas Vance, who owned half the silver coming out of the ground near Tombstone, and ran the other half by reputation. a man who measured every living thing by its dollar value, including his own blood. He had arranged her marriage to Arthur Sterling, a railroad man old enough to be her grandfather, cold as iron, who wanted a beautiful woman on his arm the same way he wanted a fine horse in his stable. A possession, a display. Eliza had left in the dark of night, riding hard until the horse gave out beneath her. The Miller gang had found her 2 days later, exactly as her father had paid them to do. "Last warning, stranger," Rufus growled. His hand drifted toward the grip of his pistol. "Ride away or we'll plant you right here." Cade didn't move. "I'm not leaving without her." The world held its breath. The cicadas in the dry brush went silent all at once, the way they do before something irreversible. Rufus's ego outweighed his instincts. "It almost always does with men like that." "Kill him," he said, and went for his iron. He was fast, for a man of his build. He was not fast enough. John Cade's hand moved in a way that seemed to defy the mechanics of time. The poncho shifted. The Colt appeared. The first shot was a single, clean crack that rolled across the yard and bounced off canyon walls a quarter-mile distant. Rufus dropped straight down, like someone had cut the strings holding him upright. He was gone before the dust rose around him. The other four froze for the span of half a heartbeat. That half heartbeat cost them everything. Cade came off midnight in one fluid motion, moving with a grace that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with 10,000 hours of hard survival. He moved through the yard with a terrible economy of purpose. Slim fired wild. The bullet grazed Cade's left shoulder, tearing through the poncho wool, spinning him a half-step sideways. Pain flared white across his face, and then his expression went flat again, and he fired twice. Slim went down, clutching his chest. The third man scrambled for cover behind a rotting water trough. Cade's shot caught him at the hip and spun him like a weather vane. The fourth man ran. He didn't make 3 strides. The fifth man, barely 20 years old, a boy who drifted into bad company one bad decision at a time, dropped his gun in the dirt and collapsed to his knees. His voice broke apart completely when he tried to speak. Please, I was just following what they told me." Cade stood in the center of the yard. His gun barrel trailed a thin thread of white smoke. The smell of sulfur hung in the still air. He looked at the trembling boy, then at the bodies scattered in the dust, then across to Eliza, who was staring at him with an expression somewhere between shock and awe. He walked to the kneeling boy slowly. Didn't point the gun at him. Just looked down with eyes that had seen too much of exactly this. "Pick up your friend by the trough," Cade said quietly. "He's still breathing. Take him and go. Don't look back." The boy was on his feet and moving before the sentence finished. He dragged his wounded companion toward the horses, mounted up with shaking hands, and rode like hell was personally chasing him. In a manner of speaking, it was. Cade holstered his weapon and walked to Eliza. He extended one hand, calloused, scarred, steady as a fence post. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. "You all right, miss?" His voice had changed. The thunder was gone. What remained was something almost gentle. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She nodded instead, pressing the back of her hand against her face, smearing dust and tears together. "I can't go back," she finally whispered. "I know," Cade said. He looked west. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. "We need to move. Men like these don't operate alone, and whoever sent them won't appreciate the news." He helped her onto midnight, climbed up behind her, and they rode out through the sagging gate without looking back. The vultures were already circling. The desert shows you 2 faces. In daylight, it's merciless and vast. After dark, it becomes a different world entirely. Cold where it was scorching, silent where the wind had howled, the stars so thick and bright overhead they almost seemed close enough to touch. Eliza began to talk as they rode. She needed to fill the silence, or maybe she just needed to say it all out loud to someone who would listen without judgment. She talked about Silas, about the way he moved through rooms like a man calculating inventory, about Arthur Sterling and his dead, acquisitive eyes, about the night she slipped out of the stables with nothing but a fast horse and 3 days of fear driving her forward. Cade listened. His face was stone, but not the cold kind, the kind that has simply absorbed so much over so many years that it stopped showing every small reaction. He had known men like Silas Vance. He had ridden into towns built on the bones of people those men had chewed up and discarded. "The Miller gang," he said, when she mentioned who had caught her. "Jack Miller runs that outfit. Smooth talker. Dangerous. Man once burned a family's home down over a card game debt and laughed while they stood watching it go." She shivered despite the lingering warmth. "Who are you, really?" she asked, glancing back at him. "The way you moved back there, that's not something a person just learns." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Just a man who's lived past his expiration," he said finally. "I've seen the worst this country offers. I've tried here and there to tip the balance the other direction. Hasn't always worked." "You still blame yourself," she said softly, "for your daughter." Something shifted in the air between them. His silence confirmed it before his words did. "Every single day," he said, "they found shelter in a limestone cave tucked into a ridge Cade had used before. He built a fire low and careful, no smoke signal for anyone tracking them, and shared the dried beef and hardtack from his saddlebag without ceremony. Every ranch girl should know how to handle a rifle," he said, passing her the Winchester. "Rich father or not," she almost smiled. It felt strange on her face after days of nothing but fear. The fire between them settled to a low, steady burn. Cade stared into it the way a man stares into something he's been carrying a long time and can't quite put down. "I used to think a fast draw solved most problems," he said quietly. "I was young enough to confuse fear with respect. Thought they were the same thing?" He poked at the coals. "But life has a way of educating a man whether he signs up for the lessons or not. I buried friends, good men. And at the end of the day, none of the gunfights I won meant a single thing. The only memory that stays with me, the one I can't outride, is my daughter standing in the doorway, waiting for me to come home." Eliza watched the firelight move across his face. The sorrow there was the real kind, the kind that doesn't perform itself for an audience. It simply existed, the way old scars exist, not dramatic, just permanent. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked. "Settling somewhere?" "Men like me don't settle," he said. "We drift until the road ends." "Sounds lonely." "It is." He rubbed his weathered hands together over the fire. "I used to tell myself there'd be time for something different later on. Small ranch, a few horses, maybe someone to share a quiet evening with." He looked down at the dirt. "Then you ride past enough graves and you stop making those kinds of promises to yourself." The wind moved through the cave entrance. Outside, midnight shifted his weight and snorted softly. "There was a rancher I knew down near the Gila River," Cade said, almost to himself. "Good man. His wife laughed all the time, the kind of laugh that made other people laugh without knowing why. He had 2 boys who followed him around everywhere like ducklings." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Fever came through that valley one winter. Took the boys first, then the mother. The rancher buried all 3 with his own hands. I never once saw him smile after that." The fire crackled between them. "That's what this country does," Cade said quietly. "Gives a man just enough to believe in, then takes it precisely when he's learned to depend on it. After enough years, a man stops reaching." Eliza had no answer for that. Neither did the desert. Only the wind spoke, and it said nothing useful. "I'm taking you to a place called Sanctuary," Cade told her as the fire burned low. "Old Spanish mission, maybe 2 days from here. Sister Maria runs it. They won't look for you there. It's off every map that men like your father read." "Is it safe?" "As safe as anywhere in this territory." She studied his profile in the dying light. "Why are you doing this?" "You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything." Cade looked at his hands for a long moment. The scars caught the firelight. "I had a daughter," he said. Just those 4 words, and then a silence that felt like the space where something massive had fallen. "She'd be close to your age now. The same kind of men came while I was away from home. I wasn't there." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. "I won't stand by again," he said simply. "I can't." The next morning rose brutal and early. By the time they were moving, the heat was already building towards something punishing. The territory they crossed was contested on 3 sides. Geronimo's Apache bands moving through the eastern passes, the U.S. cavalry sweeping the lower valleys with more enthusiasm than judgment, and somewhere behind them, whatever remained of the Miller operation licking its wounds and reorganizing. They came upon a burned wagon train near the Dragoon Mountains without warning. The smell hit them first, charred wood, something older underneath. What remained was skeletal, picked over by wind and time. Cade dismounted and crouched by the cooling ashes, reading the ground with the patience of a man who had been taught that soil tells the truth even when people lie. Apaches? Eliza asked carefully. No. He pointed at the hoofprints pressed into the earth. Iron-shod. This was white men. Organized ones, he stood. Miller's crew leaves a signature. They don't just do what they're hired to do. They make a point of doing extra. Eliza stared at the wreckage. The hired guns sent to retrieve her had done this to people who had nothing to do with any of it. The weight of that settled on her heavily. They were moving through a narrow passage between two rock formations when midnight stopped and Cade went absolutely still. He sat for 3 full seconds without moving, reading the air, reading the silence. Stay quiet, he said, already sliding from the saddle. He pulled the Winchester clear of its scabbard and worked his way up the eastern slope on foot, moving between boulders with an unhurried precision that looked slow but covered ground fast. From the crest, he looked down into a shallow basin below. A dozen riders clustered around a water hole. They were checking weapons, tightening cinches, the organized choreography of men with a destination and a plan. In the center, on a pale horse, sat a man in a silk vest and a black hat trimmed with silver conchos. He was holding a telegram, reading it aloud in a voice designed to carry Jack Miller. Killed Rufus and 4 others, Miller was saying. He's heading for the mission. We cut across the canyon trail and were there before sundown. Nobody gets through, nobody gets out. Cade pulled back down the slope. His face had the particular blankness of a man recalculating rapidly. They're ahead of us, he told Eliza. They know where we're going. They've already moved to intercept. Can we go around them? One way. Devil's Throat, narrow canyon through the high country. Unstable ground, steep, prone to slides. He looked at the ridge line above them, measuring distances. It's a bad path. It's also the only one left. Devil's Throat earned its name honestly. The path climbed through shale and loose rock, the kind of terrain that shifts under hooves without warning. Midnight picked his way upward with focused concentration, his muscles working hard against the grade. Eliza held tight to the saddle and didn't look down at the drop that opened below the trail's edge. The wind came through the gap with a sound like someone screaming from a long way off. A rifle shot cracked from above, and a bullet sparked off rock 3 feet from Cade's head. Off the horse, now! He pulled Eliza clear and pushed her behind a large boulder, even as the second shot came in, closer this time. He slapped Midnight on the flank, and the bay horse bolted down the trail, 2 shooters on the rim above. Long rifles. Elevated position, clear line of sight to the trail. The worst possible situation if you were standing in the open. Cade was not going to stand in the open. He stripped off the heavy poncho and draped it over a scrub bush, settled his hat on top of it, and then began moving laterally through the rocks at ground level. Slow, deliberate, using the slope and the shadow. The shooters above kept firing at the decoy. The shots came at intervals, patient, professional. By the time they adjusted their aim to look for why the silhouette wasn't reacting, Cade was already on the rim behind them. The Winchester spoke twice. The 2 men disappeared into the canyon below without a sound. They recovered Midnight a mile further, along and pushed through the remainder of Devil's Throat as the light shifted toward late afternoon. When the path finally leveled and began descending toward the basin on the far side, the desert below them glowed in shades of amber and deep orange under the sinking sun. For a brief and impossible moment, it was beautiful. Eliza breathed it in and let herself forget, just for a second, what was waiting. Then Cade's eyes found the smoke. Black. Thick. Rising in a solid column from the direction of the mission, not cooking smoke. Not a signal fire. They got there first, he said, and his voice had gone very quiet and very flat, and Eliza felt the fear settle back into her chest, like something she'd always known she'd have to face. The mission of Sanctuary had stood for over 100 years in a fold of the desert hills, white adobe walls 3 feet thick, a bell tower reaching toward a sky it had been watching for longer than anyone alive could remember. It was the kind of place that made you feel small in a way that wasn't unpleasant. Now one of its outbuildings was burning. The heavy front doors hung open, splintered from their hinges. The garden inside the walls had been trampled flat. In the courtyard, Sister Maria stood in the center of 6 armed men with her rosary in her hands and her spine perfectly straight. The other sisters clustered behind her, silent and frightened, but following her example of refusing to become smaller. Jack Miller sat his white horse in front of her, his pearl-handled pistol loose in his hand, his expression the expression of a man who had never in his life run short of contempt. The girl was headed here. I know that, and you know that. Tell me where she is or I'll burn everything still standing. Sister Maria looked at him the way she might look at a difficult passage of scripture, with careful attention, without fear, seeking the meaning underneath. There is no one here, she said, but God. Miller smiled slowly. Then God is about to have company. He raised the pistol. Wait, the word came from the gate. John Cade rode into the courtyard on midnight alone, the last of the day's light stretched long and red behind him. He looked like something out of an older world, dust-covered, unhurried, absolutely present. Every gun in the yard swung toward him. Miller lowered his pistol and stared for a long moment. Then he began to laugh, a genuine sound, delighted in the way that men are delighted when something they've been promised finally arrives. John Cade, he said, my father told me stories. Said you were the most dangerous man in the territory. Let the women go, Cade said. Whatever business exists is between you and me. Miller shook his head, still smiling. I've been paid too well for that. Mr. Vance wants his daughter. He wants your head delivered alongside her. And I have 7 guns and you have 1 old man on a horse, so I think tonight ends the way I say it ends. Cade looked around the courtyard without hurrying. He noted the position of every man. He counted the sightlines, the shadows, the obstacles. He was operating on a narrower margin than he'd worked with in years. Age had taken some of the speed, most of the recklessness. What remained was experience, and experience was currently busy calculating whether experience was going to be enough. The wind shifted. Smoke from the burning outbuilding rolled across the courtyard in a sudden thick wave, and for 3 seconds visibility dropped to nearly nothing. 3 seconds was all John Cade had ever needed. He was off midnight before the smoke reached him fully, both Colts clear of their holsters, moving low and fast. The courtyard erupted. Cade moved through it like a man who had memorized the choreography, but not without cost. A shot caught his left side. Another raked the stone inches from his face. He was operating on experience and nerve, and the particular stubborn refusal to fall down that had kept him alive through 42 years of poor decisions. He found Sister Maria in the gray haze and grabbed her arm. Chapel, move, now! The sisters needed no second invitation. They ran, and Cade covered their passage until the heavy chapel doors closed behind them. He turned back. 6 men down. 1 remaining. Miller. The man was already trying to mount his horse, trying to put distance between himself and what was happening. Cade tracked him through the smoke, squeezed off a shot, and a bullet tore through his leg at exactly that moment. He went down hard on one knee, the leg folding beneath him, pain blazing up through his hip and into his spine. Through the white flare of it, he watched Miller stop his horse and turn, and level the pearl-handled pistol with something that looked almost like regret. End of the trail, Miller said. Nothing personal, legend. A rifle shot cracked from the mission gate. The sound was too sharp for a pistol, too purposeful for random fire. Miller's horse shied sideways, rearing, nearly spilling him from the saddle, and in the moment it took him to regain control, Cade's last bullet found him. Miller fell from the white horse and hit the courtyard stones and did not get up again. The 3 surviving men looked at their fallen leader, looked at the smoke, looked at the figure at the gate holding a Winchester with steady hands, and made a unanimous silent decision to be somewhere else immediately. They were gone before the echo of hoofbeats faded. Eliza dropped the rifle and ran across the courtyard. Are you— I'll live, Cade said through his teeth. Clean through. Nothing broken. He looked at her with something approaching respect. Good shot. You taught me this morning, she said. Apparently, it stuck. That night, with his leg cleaned and wrapped by Sister Maria's careful hands, Cade sat beneath the chapel awning in the quiet that follows chaos. The smoke had thinned. The surviving horses were restless in the stable. Somewhere in the compound, one of the sisters was singing something in Spanish, soft and low. Eliza brought 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him without asking permission. They listened to the mission bells move in the wind. Most people, she said finally, would have kept riding that afternoon. Cade stared out into the dark. Most people would have been smarter, he said. And Eliza Vance laughed, a real laugh, the first one in what felt like a lifetime. It surprised her. She hadn't known it was still in there. Morning came cold and quiet. Cade stood on the mission porch, leaning on a rough-cut crutch, watching the desert light up by degrees the way it did every morning, regardless of what the day before had contained. Eliza stood beside him.
Sister Maria says I can stay, she said.
Help with the school. The orphans, she paused. My father will look for a while. Eventually he'll decide the desert took me. It's a good life, Cade said. You've got the heart for it. And you? He looked at the horizon, long and empty and full of something that called to him the way certain men are called to certain roads for reasons they never quite learned to explain. Still have debts, he said. Still carrying things that need putting down properly. The road's the only place I've ever figured out how to think. He whistled once and Midnight came trotting from the stable, coat brushed, eyes ready. Getting into the saddle cost him. He felt the wound through every motion, jaw tight against it. But he settled into the familiar leather and the pain became manageable, which was all he ever asked of it. He looked at Eliza one last time. Don't let the world make you into something smaller than you are, he said. It'll try. Don't let it. I won't, she held his gaze. Thank you, John Cade, for all of it. He touched the brim of his hat. Then he turned Midnight toward the open trail and rode out through the mission gates without looking back. The desert received him the way the desert receives everything eventually, with vast, indifferent patience. Within the hour, he was a dark shape against the shimmering distance. Within 2, he was part of the horizon itself. The story of what happened at the Mission of Sanctuary spread the way stories spread in that country, carried by travelers, embellished at bar counters, refined at campfires until certain details became fixed in the retelling. They talked about the 5 men at the ranch. They talked about Devil's Throat. They talked about a young woman who picked up a rifle when it mattered. John Cade didn't ride for the stories. He never had. He rode because there was always another valley ahead, and somewhere in one of them, a debt he was still working out how to pay. The dust settled behind him. The mission bell rang once in the morning air. The desert doesn't forget anything. It just waits long enough for you to think it might have. That's where we'll leave John Cade tonight. Somewhere on the trail. Somewhere between what's behind him and whatever's waiting ahead. If you rode along with us through this one, we'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and stay by the fire. There are more trails to cover, more stories where the light comes from the same direction as the shadows. Next time, we're heading into the Superstition Mountains, a lost gold mine, the men who went looking for it and the ones who came back wrong. You won't want to miss it. Until then, keep your powder dry and watch the horizon. We'll see you on the next dusty trail.